I want to welcome all of you. I'm Barb Schneider. I am chair of the Beach Committee. This is not a Beach Committee meeting. It is really just an opportunity that we have provided for you to hear a recap and sort of a remembrance of what we all learned just under 4 years ago. I think it was August of 2020 when the Select Board heard this presentation for the first time. And I thought that with all of us having our eyes wide open from this past winter, we are all looking at our shorelines with a very different attitude. And I thought it would be helpful for us to hear what the scientists and what those who really understand the coastline had to say to us and warned us about and have given us for advice, so that as your select board, as your beach committee, as your DPW goes forward, you can remember what you're learning here and why we're doing what we're doing and why we're concentrating on the beaches as your first line of defense, which I will say Governor DeSantis stole from us this past week as his slogan when he gave $500 million in beach nourishment money to the state of Florida. And let that be an awakening to all of us living with coastline, that we have to start thinking this costs money to save what we call our first line of defense. Not our beaches to play beach ball and frisbee. This is saving what we have for infrastructure. And that's how your beach committee is looking at this. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Leslie Fields and to the Woods Hole Group. And we will have a question and answer time at the end. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
All right, thank you. So I actually think I can sit down because Barbara just said everything that we plan on saying, but it was a good introduction. Yes. It's nice to see so many friendly faces and neighbors and colleagues in the audience. So I've also got, my name's Leslie Fields. I'm with the Woods Hole Group. I'm a project manager, senior coastal geologist. I've also got Kirk Bosma here, project manager, senior coastal engineer. He's going to make the lion's share of this presentation today, but I just wanted to let you know that Woods Hole Group is an environmental consulting firm. We're located up in Bourne. We used to be in Falmouth. A large part of our business is focused on helping municipalities, organizations, towns, cities identify vulnerabilities to sea level rise and climate change, and then taking it the next step forward, sort of identifying adaptations so that we can reduce risk to flooding and sea level rise. So we have been working with the town over the past, I guess, 6 or 7 years on these issues. We're going to be talking tonight exclusively about work that we've done in the Surf Drive area. Okay. One of the first studies we did was a town-wide vulnerability assessment for the town of Falmouth. And that was done sometime between 2017 and 2020. And so what that was, as I said, a town-wide vulnerability assessment where we were looking at vulnerability of public assets to sea level rise, flooding, both now and in the future. And so when I talk about assets, I'm talking about sort of the built infrastructure as well as natural assets, natural features. So examples of the built infrastructure are municipal buildings, roads, parking lots, any sort of utilities like the sewer that's owned by the town of Falmouth and run by the town of Falmouth. We were looking at vulnerability to those assets. And then we also looked at vulnerabilities to the beaches, salt ponds, salt marshes, natural features like that. What we found when we did that vulnerability assessment is that assets along Surf Drive, many of them, they ranked within the top 10 most assets with the highest risk. So that means things like Surf Drive, the road itself, Oh, did I do that? Surf Drive itself, right here. Also the bathhouse at the Surf Drive Public Beach. The parking lot at Surf Drive Public Beach. Also the pump station, sewer pump station at the public beach. We also identified the sewer main under the bike path at Trunk River as an asset that's at risk. And then obviously the beaches and salt ponds and salt marshes along Surf Drive. All assets that the town uses frequently, relies on, all at risk from of flooding and climate change, impacts of climate change. So the town took that information and they applied for a grant through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant Program. It's a state-run program. And they got a grant to prepare a Surf Drive resiliency plan. So that is, or was, a site-specific resiliency planning effort just for Surf Drive. And it identified actions the town could take in the Surf Drive area to increase resiliency to flooding and storm damage. And as a part of that project, we developed a framework as well as timelines for implementation of certain actions that could reduce resiliency or improve resiliency. Kirk's going to spend most of his presentation talking about that study. So I'm going to turn that over to him in just a second. I've got just a couple slides here also just to say that at the time we rolled that study out, we understood that the solutions seemed big and complex and sort of hard to wrap your head around. They're going to take a lot of planning, a lot of effort by the town to address them, but the idea was that the town needs to start planning and working towards those actions now, then and now. We also felt that there were a number of people that believed that maybe we didn't need to take action quite so soon, that we had more time. And I think that those of you who live in town, which I guess all of you do, but that we sort of got a sense of what was going on or what could happen this winter with all the storms we had this winter. So we had 6 particularly notable storms that impacted Surf Drive this winter, 2 in December, 2 in January, and 2 just recently in April. So this is a picture of some of the damage along Surf Drive in the December 18 storm. One thing I was going to say is that 3 of those storms, the December 18 and the 2 January storms, had water levels in Woods Hole that ranked 8, 9, and 10 in terms of elevation since 1935. So they were the highest water levels, or ranked the highest water levels, 8, 9, and 10 since 1935, all within a 2-month period. So I think it's an indication that the climate is changing. There's increased impacts from sea level rise and increased storm intensity and changes in the storm patterns. What we see here is some damage from the December 18th storm along Surf Drive. You can see, you can see here damage along the actual roadway where the asphalt's cracking. And up here, this is right at the end of Mill Road. We had about 20 to 30 feet of loss of dunes in that area during this storm. Here's a video of the January 10th storm. This is down near the Moores Bathhouse. So Surf Drive is actually, right in here. You can see all the overwash, sediment, rocks, gravel, cobble, as well as water covering the road. And the road had to be closed off during many of these storms. Okay, and then here's another video of that same storm event. This is a little bit closer to Elm Road. So here's a school bus trying to navigate this. You can see this whole area in here. This is all Surf Drive, all completely inundated, overwashed with sediment. The end of Elm Road was flooded, as was the end of Walker Street and much of Surf Drive to the east of here. This is something we got from the Cape Cod Times. Yeah, I'm sure it was a drone though, yeah. So here's more damage during the January 13 storm. This is, again, Surf Drive. You're moving, this is a bike path where it crosses Surf Drive is right behind you here, sort of a higher spot on the road. And yet there's lots of, sustained lots of damage along this riprap revetment here, and the road was actually undermined in certain places. And then this here is the dune. That is, if you go down Mill Street, take a left. So it's the dune that's right to the left there before you get to Fresh River. And it has been reduced literally to 1 or 2 feet wide at this point. So there's really little to no protection that that's going to provide during next year's storm, unless we get out there and do some sort of dune nourishment. And you can see here at the end, lots of flooding on Surf Drive. There's actually a truck that decided wisely to turn around and stay out of the water. So I'm going to let Kirk talk a little bit about what was in the Surf Drive Resiliency Plan.
Thanks, Leslie. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As Leslie mentioned, I'm going to go a little bit into a deeper dive on the Surf Drive assessment that we worked on. You can see Surf Drive there, kind of an aerial view, and it's a barrier beach fronting salt ponds, extremely low elevation, really, for a lot of the compared to a lot of the coastline. When I first moved to Falmouth, I lived right on Main Street and would take my bike out almost every day on either the Shining Sea Bikeway or right down along Surf Drive. So pretty familiar with the area. It's an awesome place, but is under kind of ongoing and future threat. So what we really focused on after that initial town-wide vulnerability assessment was the Surf Drive corridor area, and that included everything all the way up to Town Hall. So it was that big box area. So it wasn't just the shoreline or just Surf Drive. We were really looking at the salt ponds and everything else. And so that town-wide vulnerability assessment that Leslie mentioned really identified Surf Drive as really one of the key areas most at risk, not just today, then obviously going forward into the future. But the town wasn't just concerned with the road or the bathhouse, right? It was really this overarching look at the area, so including all the natural resources. So the habitat, the beaches, the water quality, the salt ponds, everything was really something that was supposed to be evaluated in this look. And as Leslie mentioned, we got a state grant to really dig into it a little bit more and try to figure out ways or pathways forward to build the resiliency for this area. So how did we get here? I'm not going to spend tons of time on this, but we're dealing with these changing climate conditions, and we'll unpack what that means a little bit more in terms of sea level rise. But we have this increasing concentration of greenhouse gases that basically are eliminating the heat escape from the atmosphere, and so we have a warming global climate. And that really took off after the Industrial Revolution here in 1850, where you can see the parts per million of carbon dioxide, and then it just shoots up to almost double of that where we were historically. And so that's causing some of this increased temperatures. And so there's been many, many studies, and I'm not a climate scientist. I am a coastal engineer dealing with the water. But there's been tons of work looking at just how the global temperature is changing, right? So this is a map here that says from 1901 to 2016, here's kind of how the globe has been warming over that time. That's just the surface temperature of the Earth. And then that, of course, translates into what we think's happening with the water. And that's caused by just increased temperature in the water, increases the molecules that you see, so you have an expanded area due to the water. And then obviously you have things like melting ice caps that contribute more volume to the water. And so we have this increased sea level rise that's been occurring historically over time. So I did want to spend a little bit of time on what the state is doing, because I think it's important to understand what you're looking at from the standpoint of that. So if you don't know anything about climate change or anything like that, that's okay. I'll be honest, I don't know that much either, right? But in terms of what we see with sea level, it's very obvious we have data. So we can measure what's happening with the water level, right? It's just a known thing, right? So this is from 1920 to 2000. This is the trend of where sea level has gone, and it's been slowly increasing over time, right? And if you look at more recently, this has actually been kind of accelerating in time, right? So what scientists are looking at is, all right, since 2000, I'm sure you've heard of the International Panel of Climate Change that looks at these things, the IPCC, and they did some projections, and they said, okay, here's what might happen with sea level rise, and these are the curves looking at it going forward in the future. And these are based on models that look at how emissions are happening across the globe. What are we doing as a society, releasing carbon dioxide and other emissions and greenhouse gases, and based on how we might change things, you can get lower or higher curves, right? And they did that initial study around 2000, and the curves were pretty low projections at that time, and you can see these little dots here. They actually were, about 2010, 2011, they were actually way under predicting what was actually happening with climate change and sea level rise. So they go back to the board and they look at more models and they try to address what's happening, and they come up with more curves. And you can see how variable this is over the short term, right? And so now we've seen a little bit of a downturn in here, and so sea level has kind of slowed down a little bit, right? And so now they're kind of over projecting what's happening. But this changes on a kind of day-to-day or annual basis where the water levels go up and down based on what's happening with the globe. And so what the state did is they looked at these various curves, and these were developed specifically by scientists at UMass Amherst to look at, for the state of Massachusetts specifically, relative to what's happening with the global sea level, but also subsidence in Massachusetts, changes in the Gulf Stream, the way the ice is melting at the polar caps. Here's what we think is going to happen with sea level rise in Massachusetts. And this is not that dissimilar from what the national curves look like, all right? There's subtle adjustments to those. And these four colors you see here basically represent different projections of how sea level may come up, all right? And that goes from a intermediate level here, which is this lower one at light green, all the way up to this extreme level, which is up here. And that just varies based on how you think the polar caps may melt and how things may change. But certainly we've seen an acceleration in sea level rise, and it varies again over time. And the state said, well, based on what we're seeing, we're going to go with this blue line here, which is the high projection of sea level rise, right? Does that mean that's what's going to happen? No, not necessarily, right? But it's one estimate of what might occur in the future, right? And so at 2030, they say, well, we might have 1.3 feet of sea level rise increase from 2000, right? At 2050, we might see 2.5 feet of sea level rise. Now, if you say, well, I think I'm more, and it looks like we're more on this curve down here, well, then we can just say, well, okay, maybe 2.5 feet won't happen by 2050. Maybe it's more like a 2070 time frame, right? The important thing to remember here is what we're looking at in terms of results as we go forward. You can shift the time horizon, right? So just because the state says we want you to use this projection, we have time to see what actually happens and adjust what we might want to do in the future based on what we observe and what we see, right? So the results and the scientific information we're presented are not tied into this blue curve per se, right? You just have to shift what your time horizon you're looking at based on what you think is going to happen or what you actually observe is happening over time. Now, why did the state pick the blue, right? Well, they were thinking about very critical assets, right? We started this work at the Central Artery Tunnel System, the Big Dig, right? And they're like, we don't want this underwater, right? Hospitals, Partners Healthcare came to us and said, we don't want our hospitals underwater, right? So they're going to try to manage their risk in saying, we don't want to get caught with our pants down, right? So we want to use, a higher level of projection here than maybe what an intermediate level would be, okay? Now, if you have a different asset, right, you might be a little bit reduced risk level. So that means maybe you pick a lower rate. Or you say, I can deal with flooding under a 10-year level versus, a 100-year level. Ultimately, what the state did is said, if you're looking at this green curve down here, what that means is that with a kind of RCP 4.5, which is a regional concentration pathway, don't get lost by that, kind of that intermediate level, right, that it's a 50-50 chance you could be above or below that. And if you're planning for something that might be above or might be below, I'm probably not going to risk that, right? It's a coin flip at that point. So the state said, we'd rather use these values as an up to amount and be safe versus doing something to this level and then find out that we missed the mark, right? We can always wait longer, but we can't ignore it, right? And then get to a point and say, oh my goodness, it's higher than we thought, right? So as we go through this, understand, right, that what we're trying to do is provide good planning time frames and good forward looking. That doesn't mean you have to do something right now, but boy, at least be aware of what's happening. You can watch what's happening so that you can plan for the future, all right? Okay, enough of that. Let's get back to Surf Drive. So framework and processes, we worked with the town on this. We worked with all the various boards, DPW, commissions, Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee, and we came up with goals, right? Which were basically, we wanted to continue to promote clean and welcoming shoreline. We wanted to improve the resiliency of not only the infrastructure, but also the natural resources, and continue the use, access, and enjoyment of that area. So that's a key thing. We're trying to maintain that usage that we have now as long as we can. We wanted the study to be science and data driven. I just spent a whole bunch of time talking about science and data driven. That's what's backing this all up, all right? And then it needed to be community led. So there were a lot of engagement processes through the 2018 through 2020 timeframe where we're meeting with the public. We had public workshops. There were surveys that went out. A lot of the stuff you hear today was actually developed from you guys, okay? How did we end up doing this? So we use this approach called dynamic adaptive policy pathways, all right? And really what that is, in simple terms, is a way to manage your risk over time, okay? I think the easiest way to understand this is this chart here, right? So say this is your acceptable risk level, and if you go above that, you're no longer happy with your risk to your asset, whether it's Surf Drive or the bathhouse or the beach or a salt marsh, right? And so we're here and we know that we have some time before that risk becomes unacceptable. But we know that based on the projections, whether it's a higher projection or a lower projection, eventually over time it's going to become a problem, right? So the storms you saw the last winter, right, they were probably worse than they were 10 years ago, worse than they were 10 years before that, getting probably more problematic just because the sea level is going up. Maybe it's not going to go up as that fast in the future, but it's still going up, right? Okay, so if we try to just fix it today with one thing, let's just fix it, okay? But that's an inflexible adaptation, meaning we did it, now we can't change it, we're tied into that, right? That might follow a curve like this, and that will work, and it will reduce your risk over certain times, but then once you get to a certain point, you're going to be past that acceptable risk level, and now it's inflexible. Like I did it, right? That's what I'm stuck with, right? What this tries to do is say, let's keep our options open as long as possible and allow flexibility in the design so that when we get to a certain point where we get to a trigger point, say sea level goes up another foot and we now know that we have an issue that we're going to have to deal with, let's take a step to reduce that risk, and then maybe it comes back up, but we can take another step, right? So on and so forth. So we're managing that adaptation or that planning approach as long as possible to stay under that acceptable risk level. That's what this is in a nutshell, right? We're making decisions as we go to keep Surf Drive and the Surf Drive corridor the way it is now as best we can, but understanding there might have to be some tough decisions made in the future to make sure we manage that risk level. The key to this is that it buys you time, right? You don't have to make a decision today. Like, okay, let's take Surf Drive and just raise it up 5 feet. Okay, well, why, right? Has the sea level gone up? Do we know it's going to go up 5 feet tomorrow? Probably not, right? Well, let's just build a bridge. Okay, well, let's just get rid of Surf Drive, right? So we need to understand that we're going to buy time for the decisions, right? It builds in flexibility. Really, really key. right? It used to be that engineers had to design something for, here's my design level, this is my wind speed, right? I'm going to design it for this wind. Okay, that's not how wind works anymore. Wind today might be totally different 25, 30 years from now. So we have to be flexible in the way we're thinking about design parameters, right? It keeps those options open, right? We don't want to box in, right? We don't want to make a decision that we might regret later on. So let's understand what's happening, allows for learning along the journey. We're monitoring what's happening, right, as we go, so that we don't have to be stuck with the decision we have today. So that's what this was used for. This is generated out of the Netherlands, kind of came up with it, which you'll think is kind of funny, the way the Netherlands have kind of built walls and dikes everywhere. But now they're evolving to say, hey, we need to be flexible in how we're approaching things. And there's some places in Europe that are definitely using this. New Zealand has a number of projects that use this dynamic adaptation approach. Okay, so we've identified the problem. The problem is what? All right, we have, in the future, we're probably going to have some issues if sea level goes up with just daily high tide flooding. What does that mean? That means every day we might see water in certain areas. And this down here, a little hard to see, is, you know, what we would see kind of present day, 2030, 2050, 2070. Again, using that high projection. If you don't believe the high projection, I'm okay with that. I'm not necessarily a believer in the high projection either, right? But that just means, okay, that's not maybe 2030, maybe that's more like 2050, 2070, 2100, okay? Just gives me more time, and that's okay, right? But you can see where the blues kind of start to cross into areas. That means the water's, at high tide, your water's going over your road, right? So by about 2050 under the high projection, there's a lot of areas of Surf Drive that are going to be underwater 2 times a day. Okay? So what you see now in a storm event is what's going to be seen twice a day in 2050. Or again, if you believe in a lower rate, 2070. Or even a lower rate, 2100. Okay? So daily flooding. Okay? You can imagine storms make it worse, right? So now, this is from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, which is a physics-based model that looks at storms and how they push water around, wind, waves, move that. That's another whole presentation for another day. These probabilities down here are the percent chance you're going to get wet. So if you see a greenish one, that's a 1% annual chance. Okay? So it's like if you check the weather in the morning and there's a 1% chance of rain, you're probably not too worried about it. You're not going to grab your umbrella, right? If you're down here in the blues, you're at 50%, 100%. You check the rain forecast, what are you getting? An umbrella, right? Okay? So that means 100% is an annual storm, 1 time per year. It's not every day, it's not the high tide flooding, it's a storm-based thing, right? So those blues, which shouldn't be surprised about, right, are going to cause flooding in various areas, right, which you already kind of see, okay? And this is kind of that present day risk. So you have a 100% chance or a 1% chance, which is a 100-year type condition. So you're not going to, if you get a 100-year storm, you're going to see flooding in some different areas. But that evolves over time. If you add sea level rise and the storms continue to evolve, right now you're in 2030, that's a increasing risk. Now you're in 2050. Or if you believe in a lower sea level rise projection, 2070, 2100, and now 2100. Now you're at 100%, right, in a big area, right? So that just means on average once a year or more, you're going to see some storm that's going to probably flood a lot of this area, okay? That's not overly surprising. It's very low, right? And again, that could be shifted to 2100, 2150 if sea level doesn't go as fast as they project, is what the state is telling you to project, okay? Last problem we identified is coastal erosion. You've seen that. Leslie showed you some pictures. Here's some more, right? So there's problems out there. When you get a big storm, you got energy. One thing Leslie didn't talk about is we got these coastal inlets that kind of clog up. That's another problem that we have to deal with, right? Pushing sand around. Now I got water when it rains backed up in my coastal ponds. That's not a great thing. Maybe water quality is messed up, right? We'd like to get that open again at some point. And so it's a mix of the various problems that we're faced with, right? Identification of the assets in the corridor, right? So Leslie went through all this already, but there's low-lying neighborhoods in the Fresh River area. We've got electrical substations that go over to the islands, which are pretty important. We got sewer lines, parking lots, you know, not to mention all the natural resources. So not going to dwell too much on this. You guys know the area, right? Shining Sea Bikeway is an awesome thing. Not so awesome if it's underwater twice a day, right? So we had a lot of things to think about. And then what we did is we developed all these potential actions that we wanted to think about from a dynamic perspective. So does this mean these were the answers? No. This was just the litany of things that we could think about that we might be able to do here. And we basically put them into various categories just to make it easier to kind of manage and deal with. One of them was a natural resource focused theme. So if we just focused on natural resources in the area, how could we build resilience for them? Okay. If we focused on protection, let's protect everything. What does that look like in terms of adaptation options? If we focused on connection, and what we meant by that was, if all else fails, we want to be able to keep the connections, meaning the bikeway, the roadway, the sewer main, right? Keep the connections in place, especially since the sewer main goes down to Woods Hole, okay? And the last one was manage retreat. Should we start thinking about how we can adjust in the future for a retreat-based approach, okay? And so we took all those, and then we started walking through a temporal look at how this would evolve. And again, the goal was, remember, to maintain usage as you have it today as long as possible, right? So we're not looking to change Surf Drive right off the bat, right? We just want to be aware of what we're facing and make adjustments as nature is telling us, hey, you got to do something, right? So from a protection standpoint, that consisted of things of like, well, we should probably protect the sewer main. We might want to elevate or flood-proof the bathhouse, and we need to do some nourishment in the 2030 timeframe. Why just those? Because we don't need to do anything else right away for all the other stuff because they're not at imminent risk, right, until we go a little bit further. If we go to 2050, okay, now we have some other things we have to deal with. We probably have to protect the road with a revetment or a seawall. And again, this is just the protect scenario, right? We need to continue nourishing here. We've got to think about tidal controls on these ponds because if the water's getting here, they're going to flood these areas, right? You get higher waters in the ponds, right? And then by 2070, we have more stuff we have to do, okay? If we look at a natural resources approach, it's a little different. Again, these are just a litany or a list of alternatives or approaches. We have targeted beach and dune nourishment. We might have to prioritize some barrier beach acquisitions here. We're elevating the sewer pump station. Let's think about moving the sewer main back here as opposed to right on the beach. Not the greatest place for a sewer main, right? So now we might think about, okay, by 2050, we should think about maybe elevating this bikeway and then maybe moving it back to this higher elevation. We need to maybe remove some of these groins, all with the intent of eventually making this more of a natural beach setting. That doesn't mean you couldn't access it. It'd still be a beach during normal tidal conditions, but maybe it shouldn't serve as a roadway anymore, right, in the 2070 timeframe. So that, again, a natural resources approach. So we went through all these, and then we looked at, okay, how realistic are some of these alternatives, right? So we had everything from let's build a bridge over the whole thing, right, to let's just let the whole thing go away. Let's move everything back. Let's build a sea. I mean, there was everything you can think of, right, in this approach, right? And then we said, well, how much do each of these things cost? This is just the example for a specific asset. So this is the Shining Sea Bikeway, right? So could we build a revetment or sheet pile wall to protect the bikeway? Here's the cost. Does it work? Is what we intended? What's the adverse impacts, right? What if we abandoned section of the bikeway? Well, that's not great. Not from my perspective. We used to bike it every day. I don't want that. What if we elevated on a boardwalk for a section of it? Okay, great. And so we're looking at the costs and the pluses and minuses for all these types of things, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, that consisted of a mix of things, right? There's not one theme that's going to work for the area, right? You're not probably going to try to protect everything, right, with a big wall, because then you can't even see the water or the beach, right? You're probably not going to manage everything and say retreat everywhere, right? It's a mix of various solutions and alternatives. And I'm not going to go through all those today. There's tons of good information on the town website and the reports that you can dig into for that kind of stuff. All right. Thanks for hanging in there, right? So now we're going to get back to the dynamic adaptation pathways where I talked about that flexibility in design. So we'll apply it directly to Surf Drive in the Surf Drive corridor. So what I want you to think about here as we go into this next spaghetti thing is you're driving down the road, all right? And when you get to one of these little transfer stations or circles, it's like you hit a rotary, right? And now you have a number of different ways you can go, okay? If you're driving down the road and you hit this roadblock, you're done, right? That doesn't work anymore, right? If you went down that pathway up, I got to turn around. It doesn't work. It doesn't function anymore, right? These different colors, don't worry too much about those. Those are just focused on the various themes. So if you're on a green road, you're like, I'm on the natural resources road. If you're on a orange road, you're on kind of the protection road. And then if you get the dash line, it means it kind of partially works. The road isn't so good anymore. It's not as good as a solid road, right? All right? So it's basically a map for how you're going to navigate potential solutions for each asset. And then the red dash line you'll see is a preferred path that we didn't pick. That was what was decided jointly with the town and the community to say, this seems to make sense right now. Does that mean you're married to that preferred path? You all should know this answer. No, right? Because it's flexible and you have adaptations as you go. All right? So I told you it was going to be spaghetti. All right? So here is the Surf Drive roadway itself adaptations, okay? Here's the list of all the different things we came up with. Okay? Well, build the bridge, the flyway, someone said, right? What if we improve maintenance? Let's just end the road maintenance. How about beach and dune restoration? What if we remove roads? What if we raise the road? How about a seawall to protect it? What about a revetment to protect it? What if we put the revetment only so high that it just works for daily tides, but storms still get over? What if we make it high enough so storms can be stopped, right? So a whole bunch of adaptations. Key things to remember. Here's sea level rise down here, okay? So here's your marker. If we have 1 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, right? This is the high rate. This is kind of the intermediate rate, right? So 1 foot of sea level rise in the high rate happens about 2030, but it's later, 2040 here. 3 feet of sea level rise is about 2060 under the highlight rate, but later, 2070 under the intermediate rate. And if you want a lower rate, just add that. What can you do now? You can measure this over time, right? So you can constantly adjust this plan. Key point, right? So you're not tied in to, oh, I have to believe the high sea level rise rate, or I have to believe the low sea level rise rate. You don't have to believe anything. You just have to be smart and well-informed and be like, hey, I know what I'm going to do when it gets to this high because I have these options, okay? All right, so what does this mean? So we started out right away saying, hey, you should probably work on public outreach and policy. That could be happening right now. You don't have to do much of anything, but we should at least be doing this. We're doing some of it tonight, right? But just let's build understanding, right? Here, you should start thinking by 2030, we're talking about beach and dune restoration as a potential option. If you have a dark line, that is something we were saying makes sense to do. You can, of course, build a bridge today, right? And then you'd be all set down this path potentially. But we're saying why would you do that now when you don't even know what sea level rise is going to do? So until you get out to about 3 feet of sea level rise, don't worry about it. Okay, so it's a wait and see approach. These dark lines are things you might want to do. Again, if you get to a rotary, you can change paths. So let's just follow the preferred path, okay, and see how that works. So we're going to drive down the current actions. We're going to keep doing what we're doing now, which isn't much, but we're surviving. We're still using the road, right? We better be doing some public outreach and policy along the way, all right? We're going to get here. Oh, we hit a dead end. Why? Because our current actions are no longer going to work if the tide's going over the road 2 times a day, okay? All right. So now we got to make a decision. Well, we're going to definitely go down the public and outreach and policy, but let's go down this beach and dune restoration. Why? Because it seems like we could keep the way that Surf Drive corridor works today operational, right? We got a beach, we can protect it a little bit, so that we can go down that road. That works until a certain point, but why doesn't it work anymore? Water level's too high, storms are too big. I can't see the water. I can't build a beach, 10 feet high. Doesn't make any sense. I mean, it doesn't work, right? So that's a dead end at that point. So now I'm at this road. I'm like, I got to make a different decision. Well, maybe I should end road maintenance. All right, fine. And then maybe I'm going to remove the road sections. Basically, that means I'm abandoning Surf Drive. Do you have to follow that pathway? No. Say things change. You get a whole bunch of money, some development happens. You could go down the road where you're going to say, I'm going to raise the road. I can go down this road and I can go down here and start going down this road, right? The key is it gives you flexible adaptations over time, what you're trying to do, and it gives you ability to measure what's happening so you can shift this as you go, right? Grayed out areas, I'd say don't worry about it. We wait and see. Road ends and dashed areas, you got some issues with them, right? So you might have to be going down a different path. Obviously, if you have 7 feet of sea level rise, I'm not saying that's happening, okay? But if you have 7 feet of sea level rise, not much is going to work anymore besides a bridge if you really wanted a road there, okay? I mean, that only makes sense, right? But that might be in 2200, I don't know, right? So this works. This works for whatever sea level rise you might see. Then you can also take that and say, oh, I can go down a whole bunch of different roads or pathways or routes, and I can figure out how much that costs and what some of the effects are. Again, look in the report for all this. I'm not going to go through that now, but that helps you decide what your potential preferred route is. And again, you can change it as you go. You don't have to decide your preferred path today. You might want to do that if you're going on a vacation in California and driving across the country, but if you're really flexible, you can change it as you go, and that's what this is. Right? Here's another example. This is for the Surf Drive bathhouse, Mitchell Bathhouse and parking area. Here we ended up going down a route of transitioning to portable facilities at the beach and then just using it for daily access in the future. And again, there's other options that are viable and available in this approach. Here's one for the low-end neighborhood off Fresh River. And this one took more of a protection approach as a preferred thing. So we're not willing to abandon that. We're going to continue the current actions, but boy, there comes a point where those don't work anymore. We're going to go down to elevating roads, providing storm protection, and really focus on keeping that neighborhood intact for as long as we can, right? Do you have to do that? No, you could go a different way. You could go buyouts, right, or something like that. But again, that's a decision that you can wait on until you actually hit a tipping point. All right, so what does that mean for an overall implementation plan? Well, you can mix and match these as you see fit. This is just one approach, which has a mix of natural resources and protection over time, and you can see that integrates in based on what happens with sea level rise. So you start with, beach and dune nourishment here is a recommendation to maintain that usage. That transitions to more of protection along Fresh River and more of a natural resources approach for this portion of Surf Drive. And again, when that happens depends, right? All right, so to wrap this up real quick, and I know that was a lot, right? But hopefully you took some good information out of that. The key here is that it's difficult, right? Change is hard for anybody. It's hard for my, 10-year-old to deal with. Like, I don't know, change schools, change my class, like that's hard, right? This is really hard, right? You're changing a big part of the community, right? But the climate is changing, and we have to be able to flexibly move with that, right? So you want to develop that initial action plan. That's what that DAP allows you to do. We can define key triggers. I didn't talk about this, but you can define key triggers of when you might need to take action, when you might need to plan, right? You can switch paths, and it provides flexibility, which is key, right? You can, and I think we really focused on restoration of natural resources coupled with target protection of key infrastructure to meet those varied goals. Okay, so that's what that Surf Drive study did, and there's great resources online. The town did a wonderful job. You can go to the town website, go to the Coastal Resiliency Action Committee webpage. There is story maps that walk you through this, probably better than I just did. There's the full reports on there if you want to spend time with that. So that's right available on the town website. Yep, and I'm going to have Leslie talk for one more slide, and then we'll get questions, and you can be the first one to go.
I'm going to interrupt before we take questions.
Right.
Okay, that is a hard act to follow. But I wanted to say that, the Beach Committee has been working really hard to try to bring these issues to the forefront of the citizens of Falmouth. And they asked us, what can we do? And so our recommendation was go back to that surf drive resiliency planning study. Let's look at what some of those pathways were that Kirk was showing you, and let's try to follow one. Let's try to implement it. And so what we talked to them about was doing a feasibility study for dune and beach nourishment along the surf drive corridor. And so what we plan to do is to file a grant application through the Coastal Zone Management Coastal Resiliency Program. And that would be a sum of money that the town could use to conduct this beach and dune nourishment feasibility study. So the study area would be sort of that area that's shown here. So it's all the way from the end of shore over to Trunk River. And we would be evaluating different beach and dune nourishment designs with an eye towards providing, more resiliency, erosion control, and recreational beach as well. And when we do that, what we're going to be looking at in order to try to evaluate if those designs are, suitable and feasible, is to look at what level of protection do they provide. So if we build a dune, 5 feet high and 30 feet wide, and there's a beach in front of it out seaward of that, what level of protection, what kind of storm does that protect the road for? Is it a 10-year storm? Is it a 30-year storm? Is it a 2-year storm? So we're going to come up with different designs, and we're going to evaluate what level of protection they will provide, the town's assets. And that's going to provide really good information for the town to make a decision about how best to proceed. We're also going to come up with, in addition to the levels of performance, we'll be looking at permittability. Is it difficult? Is it easy to get the environmental permits? Is it more difficult? We'll be coming up with costs so the town can help identify, planning levels for the monies they need, and also maintenance requirements. So we shouldn't expect that we're going to be able to do this beach and dune nourishment and just do it once and walk away. It's going to be something that needs to be maintained, and we'll provide information on what those maintenance requirements are. So the grant applications, the RFR is due out, probably any day now, and we'll have probably until early June to get that grant application prepared. The town would hear then whether or not they were accepted by late August, early September. We'll have a year to do that project, well, until the end of the FY, so until June 30th, 2025. Assuming we can come up with some feasible alternatives and the town wants to move forward, the next step would be to apply for the next year's grant funding, and that would be for final design and permitting. And then once we get those permits, hopefully it can take about a year, we could potentially, if we're going to do this beach and dune nourishment, be ready for construction in the winter of 25 or 26. And it wouldn't necessarily be, keep on hitting that, the same project all the way along. Maybe we'd just be looking at this section. There might be different projects for different parts of the surf drive corridor. But that's a little bit about what we hope to do. We're grateful that the beach committee is sort of taking this on as their mantle to advance this project. And they did get match monies at town meeting for this. So I think we're in a good position to file the application, and hopefully we'll be successful in getting it.
Yeah, and let me add one more thing. The state really wants to see these grants come to fruition. So you got a grant to look at Surf Drive. You got the initial vulnerability assessment, then we looked at Surf Drive. What they really want to see is that next step to get to actually shovels in the ground and stuff like that. So I fully suspect they'd be really behind giving money to keep this process moving forward. So
I'm going to say one more thing. Like, if someone wants to know what they can do when we get to that point where we're writing this grant application, I'd say, letters of support. So from the neighborhood associations, Sitters Pond Group, I'm drawing a blank on the other one. Thank you. Okay, great. So, we'll be reaching out to you guys to see if you could provide letters of support. So, thank you.
How will we know that the grant
We will reach out to you.
I just want to thank them. This has been really special that they took the time to update this presentation, come here tonight and do this. We are so lucky to have Woods Hole Group and Leslie at in our midst, let me just say, and I can't thank them enough. And I want you to all help me give them a round of applause for this. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you. I want to just take a minute. 3 years ago, the beach committee was doing things like talking about how do we get lifeguards, how do we get parking attendants, what do we do about new beach attire, what do we do about people having gigundous tents. That's what the beach committee focused on 3 years ago. It is because of the leadership of Maggie Clayton, who is here with us tonight, that we have had a successful program in spending our last couple of years recruiting and getting a staff back that wants to return year after year. And I want you to know that that's the only reason that the beach committee has been able to leave those worries behind, because they are being handled so well by staff, and move on to the ideas of this problem and what we can do to help educate and move all of you to where you start to help us come up with the solutions that we must face in the next decade. So thank you, Maggie, for your leadership, and I wanted everyone to know that's why we've changed. So I want to ask real quickly, you just saw stuff that makes me think Wordle looks really easy. And I just want you to all raise your hand if you think you have noticed pretty serious change in the sea level rise and coastline erosion over the last 2 years. Thank you. That's just to answer. I know you are being very cautious about addressing this group, but I think this group is smart, and they are here because they've watched it happen in our midst, and they know we can't sit around. The other thing I want to point out is that it's taken us over 7 years to even get to start the Bourne Bridge project. So when we talk about, well, you don't have to worry, you can just come up to this block and then you can make a move. No, you can't, because in this town it takes at least 4 times coming to town meeting to get something passed. That's number one. And number 2, it takes years to get permitting to do something. So we can't just sit back and let this happen, come up against a wall and then have it change. That's why your beach committee is trying to be on this. We love having things like this happen where we can have all of you show that you're interested, you want to know more, and you want to have us help the select board in guiding them that we all care about our shorelines and we get it about how important they are. So with that, I'm going to take questions, and I will start. I think you were first, and I'll start here. Please speak into the mic because we are televising.
I was just wondering if you could go back to the slide where you had side effects. I think that was the title of the slide, and we kind of, went right through it. Yeah. And I just wanted to also tag to what you were just mentioning, though. I think that the key, the best thing about this plan is the flexibility. And while change is sometimes lengthy in town, I think we have also all seen that sometimes action is taken and then reversed, and so we wouldn't want to go down a path precipitously. I think we want to plan and do things, but we don't want to panic. So I'm just looking down on the list of side effects, and I see that loss of homes is sort of overrepresented. Did you want to comment about that? Or
So these path actions,
Yeah.
you can come up with multiple, actions and pathways to take. We just listed 7 examples. There's
Right.
probably well over 100 pathways you could take.
Okay.
So this is just a
So
representative
these are the
example.
7, though, that you've chosen to
No,
show us?
no, well, those are just 7 I
Right, yeah.
sampled.
Okay,
Now
yeah.
the preferred is the only one that was,
Right,
selected.
right.
Loss of homes in that case isn't loss of homes everywhere.
Uh-huh.
It would be right on the barrier beach. would be
Right.
the loss of
Okay.
homes. But
I'm just looking, if there's 7 kind of path actions, loss of homes is on most of them.
yeah, well, that's my point. There's not just 7.
Okay.
There's hundreds.
Oh, all right.
So it's just a sampling of those. Like, you know, depending on what you're going to do, it would, so like this, the 7th one doesn't have any loss of homes, right?
Right.
The second one, total protection, doesn't have any loss of homes.
Right, right.
So you could come up with 72 more that don't have loss of homes.
Okay. So that's where I think the flexibility would come in. That's where I think it might be key. I just wanted to return to this because we flipped through it so quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The one other thing I would say, you know, is, which I didn't spend a lot of time on, is the tipping point identification is really important, which handles the whole planning for the town, permitting, design process. That's the power of this, right? You know when the road stop or the roadblock is coming. So you just say, now I'm going to put a tipping point. If you go back to one of these a second.
And obviously you need to take action before you are at the tipping
Ex-
We have to talk.
So obviously you'd have to take action before you are at the tipping point or past it, but you might not have to take action, 30 years ahead of the tipping point. That was my
Yeah,
point
you want to
about
start taking
flexibility.
action at the tipping point, but you don't necessarily have to wait till you don't want to wait till you get to the roadblock, right? So the tipping point is put at a position where you know, hey, it's going to take me 3 years to get through this, another 2 years to get through that, another 2 years to get funding, right? So, for example, if you're like down a road where you're at the bottom there on the orange, right, and you're at 3.5 feet of sea level rise, that might be your tipping point. That says, okay, I now have got to start thinking about what my next move might be. But do you need to do that at 2 feet of sea level rise? Probably not, right? So,
There's actually a town right now that is starting to pay people to give up their homes because they have made the determination that it's not worth what it would take to try and save not the home, but the way to get to the home. So when you see these homes going up on stilts, the question is, can the town maintain the infrastructure to get to those homes? And at what point do they throw in the towel on that? And that's the big discussion to be had. So I've got 2 more over here. I've got this lady and then you.
Yeah, I just have been noticing that there are other things besides just sea level rise that are affecting the infrastructure here in town. I live on 28A, which is an old road. It's been there for 350 years. My house is at 8-foot sea level. The salt marsh came back into a third of our property. But beyond that, the road is above grade and floods our neighborhood. And sidewalks, and as I drive around town, I see that almost all the roads are inadequate for the rainwater we're now getting, and it seems to me that we're getting the ponds are so high right now that if we had more rain, they'd start overflowing from inside out. So I think concentrating just on sea level rise may not be the best thing to do, because things like salt marshes, for instance, are not replaceable. You can't rebuild a salt marsh, and right now the Great Sipwhisset Marsh is underwater at every high tide completely, which means it will not continue. And the final point is that Massachusetts, unlike most other coastal states, does not have any control over the coastline because it's private ownership below the sea level, the low tide mark, which means that no one can actually do anything without a whole lot of individual owners who may not want to have it happen.
yeah, so a couple things on that. So one, definitely look at the first study, which is the overall vulnerability assessment for the whole town. That goes beyond just Surf Drive in the coastal area. 2, definitely working on precipitation-based things across the board for the state. So we understand it's not just a coastal problem. This particular grant is focused on coastal-based resources, sea level rise elements. I can't speak to the regulations piece.
You are right that there are, ownerships within that area between mean high and mean low. So for example, with this beach and dune nourishment project along Surf Drive, if that were ever to be implemented on any of those beaches where we would nourish below the high tide line, we would have to get easements from the property owners that would allow the public to pass. And that's if we are, well, that's if we are building the project with publicly funded dollars. So public monies used to nourish beaches, there's got to be easements granted by the private property owners to allow the public to pass. And that can be that's,
That'd be a good first step.
well, we need to get the designs and see if it's feasible first.
Yeah, but we need easements around our entire coast, and.
Oh, okay, well, that's a bigger issue.
Hi, I'm here as someone whose family has had one of those beach houses on the Barrier Beach for 50 somewhat years, and I've seen amazing changes in the coastline over that time, and especially accelerating over the last few years. So my question is, I appreciate such a thoughtful and flexible approach, and my question is, what if the tipping point is something catastrophic like a hurricane? Does the plan have the flexibility, and is it able to be adapted quickly should we have a significant hurricane that might cause a lot of destruction?
Yeah, so you'll see throughout some of the, spaghetti diagrams, let's just call them, or the DAPs, like there's a storm protection and then a daily access piece. So it's kind of built in already. So the data that we have feeding this has both a kind of sea level rise, normal tidal conditions, which, by the way, that is a salt marsh thing. Sea level rise is definitely affecting the salt marshes. And then we have a storm-based data set that looks at storms. So if you're dealing with storm-based protection, your tipping point's going to come a little bit earlier, probably a lot earlier, right? Because you're saying, I need to be ready for storm events to whatever level you might want to design to, versus I'm just worried about daily tidal conditions or sea level rise. So both of those are built into the plan. So if you're saying, hey, I'm more worried about, a storm-based impact, follow the storm-based trajectory. If you're less worried about that, that's a different thing. And that can vary for assets, right? Of course, there's always going to be potentially one storm that's, so big that you just can't plan for at a black swan type event. That's just something that we have to live with. But there is that storm-based element built into that plan.
I'm wondering if the choice of abandoning the road, Surf Drive, or rebuilding it is binary, or whether there's other alternatives within that. It seems to me that over the years we've been here, the road is unstable because of the base that it's built on. The road is built on sand, and over time, it looks like the road is declining at various spots. I'm wondering if there's a way to be, in other locations or other countries, have roads that would be able to be built on sand and not decline as ours have.
So I don't think it's a binary solution. There's multiple ways that you can talk about road maintenance. So there's protecting the road, meaning looking at available options to keep the water and erosion forces off or away from the road. There's also raising the road appropriately, and then there's also things like raising sections of the road. And then there's bridge construction and various methods for that. So I think there's a number of different options for that. Again, the whole piece of this was geared towards, let's try to keep the roads, the homes, the way that the Surf Drive corridor operates today intact as long as possible, right? And then understand, if we get to that tipping point, we want to be well informed and prepared to make a move in one direction or the other, whether that's protecting the road, raising the road, keeping the road there, keeping that connection open, or if it's more of we might have to think about buyouts, removal, retreat, those type of things. There's also a heavy focus on natural resources throughout that. So maybe I'm not exactly clear on what you mean by binary, but I think there's multiple options for road, continuing the road as it is.
Yes, at first I'd like to thank the Beach Committee for grabbing the bull by the horns and taking this project on. I'm wondering, are there any selectmen here tonight?
Yes, 3, or 2 plus 1 running. Correct.
I would like to know which one that is. But it will take more than just public outreach. Our system is not geared to doing things. Our system is geared to studies, maybe reading the studies, very unlikely doing anything with the study. So, as I say, I commend the Beach Committee, but I really do wonder what's going to happen.
Don't worry, believe me. We've got 7 movers and shakers. You have to wait, Mr. Shear, I'm sorry. I promised this over here.
Hi, I have a question about the beach dune restoration. What exactly is that? Is that bringing more sand back on the beach, planting seagrass? Just because of my observations and everyone in this room, the last 6 significant storms have taken every single plant out of the dune and ripped it up and thrown it, wherever. So I'm wondering, what is sustainable? What kind of beach and dune restoration nourishment would we be talking about? That's my first question.
Okay, it's a good question. So, what we have done in other places and what I envision here is, a dune that's potentially a little bit higher than what was there, but wider. Okay, and then out in front of that, you'd have a beach with a gradual slope that I don't know how far seaward it would go, but you would have a much wider beach with the dune behind it. The dune would be planted with beach grass that would help to stabilize that feature. And you'd also probably have some sand fencing that would be up there to help trap some of that windblown material. So you'd have some natural accumulation and additional material, adding to the dune. So that's what we sort of envision, and we've done it successfully in other places. I think there's a real potential that we'll find that it's feasible in if not the whole area, certain parts of the Surf Drive corridor.
I'll just add one thought to that. I think a lot of times when you think about beach and dune nourishment, which is, basically enhancing the system that exists there with compatible material, is a lot of people just go kind of part way or halfway. Well, if we just put a dune in here, that'll work. The beach dune element is a real system, and that has to be designed appropriately, which means you need a dune, you need a berm out in front of a beach. The idea is you need to start thinking about breaking that energy that's very erosive out further offshore during those storm events. And so I think going into this, people need to understand that it can't just be a halfway type thing, right? You can't build a car with 2 wheels and say, okay, that's going to work okay, right? So it's a system that needs to be enhanced. It's been, it doesn't have a lot of sediment supply over time, and so you're trying to re-energize that. So like Town of Sandwich, who I work a lot for, is faced with a really big problem with their beaches because they've been influenced by the Cape Cod Canal pretty strongly. They've had over a century of no sediment coming into their beach system. That's why they need that beach and dune nourishment that the federal government's going to pay for, but it's hundreds of thousands of cubic yards to reestablish that system. They've done 30,000 here. These halfway things, you can't go halfway.
One thing. One potential, so just speaking about not going halfway, I agree with Kirk. You got to go all the way. And so one of the things, though, that may be limiting us on this project is the presence of eelgrass in the near shore. So that's one thing that, as a part of this grant, if the town gets it, we'd be out there mapping that eelgrass. Eelgrass is a protected resource. We're not allowed to damage it with any sort of nourishment. So, we have to have a setback from that edge of eelgrass to make sure that when that sediment does redistribute, and it will move around, that it doesn't smother that eelgrass, because that's a valuable resource we want to try to protect. So it's sort of a balancing act. Ideally, we'd like to see go as big as we can, go all the way, but we've got to protect that eelgrass at the same time.
I have two more people with questions. I'm going to take those two people, and then I'm going to ask that anyone who has other questions, email them to the beach committee, and we will make sure that you get answers. This is being televised, it's being recorded, and you'll be able to watch it again, to think about your questions, and you can always email the beach committee, and we will work on getting you the answers. Okay. Or this gentleman, did you have your hand up? No. Anybody? Okay, good. Right here, sorry. I knew it was somewhere around.
Hi, my name's Ray Schmidt. I'm a climate scientist at WHOI. I wrote a chapter in a Academy report over a decade ago about sea level rise. I think what we have to fear is not so much the rate of sea level rise. I think the high scenario is not going to happen. It's going to be one of the lower scenarios. But what is going to be a problem is the storms are getting more intense. And I can explain why if you if you want to listen to me. But the intensity of the storm is going to be a bigger problem than mean sea level rise. I mean, a decade ago it was about an inch a decade. Now it's like 2 inches a decade, and maybe next in the 30s it'll be 3 inches a decade. But you don't get to 7 feet by 2100. 7 feet will get us in 2200 probably. It'll come, but it takes a long time to melt the ice. It takes a long time to warm up the ocean. But the storms are getting more intense because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that's going to be our biggest problem. On Surf Drive, I think one of our big problems are the groins. I bike along Surf Drive all the time, and the places where the road is eroded are just to the west of every one of those groins. So just the way the waves focus around the groins, something goes on there with the sediment transport, and the road gets undermined on the west side of each one of those groins. And I just wonder what would happen if we removed them all.
Yeah, I think that's a really great observation. I've had the same observation. So, again, if we get that grant, that'll be something that we'll be looking at is, whether or not some of those groins, how effective they are, what would happen if we remove them. I think another thing we're also going to be looking at, and I know some of you here in this room are familiar with it, but just the inlets. So it's Salt Pond and Fresh, how they're filling in. So that's definitely got to be a part of what we evaluate when we look at this beach nourishment project is, how can we minimize that? So it's something we'll be looking at, as well as, the effectiveness of the groins and whether or not they could be removed.
I would say, as all of us on the beach committee noted, and the beach department staff, we got, not only is it intensity, but it's how frequent, and the fact that we had 3 storms within 3 weeks of each other this year killed us. We had no time to regroup, put things back in place between 2 of the storms, and it will be more and more a problem if we keep getting those. And you notice it's happening in December a lot now. So thank you.
Yeah, just to add one thing to that. So remove groins is a key part of a lot of the adaptation options that you find. And then the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, which you might be familiar with, does include increasing intensity and frequency of storms. So the data itself has that built into it. So it's not just sea level rise. It's got that in there.
So if sea level rise is increasing, maybe not to the extent that we think it's going to, but certainly storms with their intensity and their frequency are, that's a progressive thing. When we talk about beach nourishment, it almost seems like a static thing, or is it going to take into account that this is a progressive issue?
Yeah, so beach nourishment, right? I would never call that a static solution because it's a very dynamic process, right? Beach nourishment in a good day in Florida, right? If they can get 7 to 10 years performance out of that, that's a very effective beach nourishment project. So, you know, whether or not, I don't know what if it's not like this is a 50-year service life for a beach nourishment, right? It's much shorter than that. But yeah, the storms are very important. Like I said, they're built into the model. They'll be assessed as part of it. So when we do a beach nourishment design, it's not just what level it's going to protect against, it's how long it's going to last under those kind of conditions. So that piece is something that's evaluated when you think about the design. And if you remember from the actual look here, right? I mean, beach dune restoration does have endpoint where it just won't make fiscal sense anymore and really work. So that initial path recommendation, and again, depending on, what sea level rise and storms do, you could extend that maybe a little further or whatnot. But it's something that's geared towards keeping operations in the surf drive corridor as they kind of are today as best as possible. And you're going to get some added benefit of additional recreation and first line of defense enhancement and all those types of things that come with it. But it's not, again, the silver bullet.
Okay, I want to thank you all again. Really appreciate your being here. I hope you'll carry this message out to your neighbors and your friends. And Beach Committee meets on the third Wednesday of every month at the Rec Center at 6 o'clock. And you can always pull up our minutes online. Thank you again. Have a good evening.